It's roughly 200,000 years ago. You're not a king, not a farmer, not anyone special, just a Homo sapiens standing somewhere in East Africa, mostly worried about your next meal and hoping nothing bigger than you is currently hunting. If you could somehow snap a photo of yourself and hold it up next to the 8 billion people alive right now, one detail would jump out immediately. You almost certainly wouldn't be pale, you wouldn't be East Asian in complexion, you definitely wouldn't be pulling out sunscreen every summer. The very first modern humans were, with near certainty, dark-skinned, which leads to a genuinely strange question. Here's the thing nobody tells you about that question. If every human being on Earth descends from that same dark-skinned population, where did the rest of the spectrum actually come from? Because right now, skin tone ranges from extremely dark to extremely pale, with essentially every shade in between, scattered across the planet in a pattern that turns out to be anything but random. So let's actually work through it, piece by piece, because the real explanation has almost nothing to do with what most people assume. Start with the molecule doing all the actual work. Melanin. It's produced by specialized cells in your skin called melanocytes, and it comes in two main forms: eumelanin, which is dark brown to black, and pheomelanin, which is reddish yellow. Every human being, regardless of skin tone, has roughly the same number of melanocytes. What differs isn't the quantity of pigment-producing cells, it's how much melanin those cells actually produce and which type they favor. Dark skin isn't the presence of some special pigment absent in lighter skin. It's simply more eumelanin, produced at a higher rate, packed more densely into the skin's outer layers. Now here's where it gets interesting, because melanin isn't cosmetic. It's a shield. And the thing it's shielding you from is ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Anthropologist Jablonski and geographer George Chaplin, working together at Penn State, spent years mapping something that turns out to be remarkably precise: the relationship between a population's traditional geographic latitude and its average skin tone correlated directly against satellite-measured levels of ground-level UV radiation. The pattern they documented is almost eerie in its consistency. Populations that lived for tens of thousands of years near the equator, where UV exposure is intense and constant year-round, consistently developed darker skin. Populations that migrated toward higher latitudes, where UV exposure is weaker and more seasonal, consistently developed lighter skin. This isn't a loose correlation. It's one of the tightest, most predictable patterns in all of human biology, and it maps almost perfectly onto a straightforward physics problem: how much UV radiation is actually reaching the ground where your ancestors lived. But here's the thing nobody tells you. UV radiation isn't simply dangerous. It's a double-edged problem, and understanding both edges is the key to the entire story. The first edge is damage. Intense UV exposure breaks down a molecule your body needs constantly: folate, a B vitamin, critical for DNA synthesis and repair. Jablonski and Chaplin's research specifically highlighted folate's role in two processes where a deficiency is catastrophic: neural tube development in a growing fetus, where insufficient folate is directly linked to severe birth defects, and sperm production in adult males, where UV-damaged folate levels have been shown to reduce fertility. In a high UV environment near the equator, unprotected pale skin would have meant a real, measurable, ongoing threat to successful reproduction, generation after generation. Dark skin, dense with eumelanin, functions as a highly effective natural sunscreen, blocking the majority of incoming UV radiation before it can degrade folate in the skin's blood vessel. In that environment, the evolutionary pressure toward darker skin wasn't subtle. It was directly tied to whether your children survived to be born and whether you could father them in the first place. There's a second layer to the folate problem worth sitting with, because it isn't only about pregnancy and fertility in the abstract. Folate is also essential for rapid cell division generally, meaning any process in the body that depends on producing new cells quickly: wound healing, immune response, ongoing DNA repair, becomes measurably less efficient when folate levels drop. In an equatorial environment, with UV radiation bombarding exposed skin essentially every single day of the year, an unprotected population wouldn't just face one isolated risk. It would face a slow, compounding disadvantage across multiple biological systems simultaneously, stacking up generation after generation until the selective pressure toward denser eumelanin became close to overwhelming. So if dark skin is the protective folate-safe option, why does anyone have light skin at all? Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the second edge of the UV problem points in the exact opposite direction. Your body needs a specific amount of UVB radiation to synthesize vitamin D in the skin, a nutrient essential for calcium absorption, bone development, and immune function. Severe vitamin D deficiency causes rickets, a disease that softens and deforms bones. And historically, it could be fatal in children and devastating to pregnant women's pelvic development, directly threatening safe childbirth. In regions farther from the equator, where UV radiation is weaker, and for parts of the year, nearly essentially absent entirely, dense melanin becomes a liability instead of a shield. Skin packed with pigment blocks so much UV that it can't synthesize enough vitamin D to stay healthy. Populations that migrated into these lower UV regions and stayed there for tens of thousands of years faced a new opposite pressure. Skin needed to lighten, letting in enough UVB to keep producing adequate vitamin D, without the protection that was no longer strictly necessary. That's the wild part. The exact same molecule, melanin, is simultaneously protective and restrictive, and which effect actually matters most depends entirely on how much sunlight is hitting the ground where you live. Skin color isn't humanity drifting towards some ideal default. It's an ongoing, localized balancing act between two opposing survival pressures, and different populations in different places landed on different points along that same trade-off. Here's the thing nobody tells you about how recently a lot of this actually happened, because the timeline is far more compressed than most people assume. Ancient DNA research has repeatedly overturned the assumption that light skin arrived in Europe alongside the first modern humans who settled there. Genetic analysis of Mesolithic European hunter-gatherer remains, including the well-studied skeleton nicknamed Cheddar Man in Britain and comparable remains from Spain's Logroño site, has shown something genuinely surprising. These individuals, living roughly 7 to 10,000 years ago, still carried genetic variants associated with notably dark skin, despite their ancestors having lived in Europe for tens of thousands of years by that point. Population genetics research led by researchers including Iosif Lazaridis and David Reich at Harvard has helped trace how the genetic variants most strongly associated with lighter skin in modern Europeans, particularly a gene called SLC24A5, appear to have spread through the population significantly later, arriving with migrating farming populations from Anatolia beginning around 8,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that's remarkably recent. Widespread light skin in Europe may be less than 10,000 years old, a genuinely small fraction of the roughly 200,000 years modern humans have existed at all. Now here's where it gets even stranger, because light skin didn't actually evolve just once. Researchers comparing the genetics of light skin in Europeans versus East Asians made a finding that initially seems to contradict the whole story. The two populations largely achieved lighter skin tone through different genes entirely. Europeans owe much of their lighter pigmentation to variants in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2. East Asian populations, meanwhile, achieved comparably light skin primarily through variants in a different gene, OCA2, among others. Two separate human populations, migrating away from the equator, on entirely different continents, independently arrived at a similar outcome. Lighter skin, suited to lower UV environments, through largely separate genetic paths. That's not one shared adaptation slowly spreading outward from a single point. That's convergent evolution, the same evolutionary solution appearing more than once, independently, because the underlying physics problem, not enough UVB to safely produce vitamin D, was identical in both places. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the specific, most extreme case of all this. Red hair and very pale, freckling skin, tied largely to variants in a single gene called MC1R. Under normal conditions, MC1R signals melanocytes to produce eumelanin, the dark UV protective pigment. Certain loss-of-function mutations in MC1R shift that production toward pheomelanin instead, the reddish pigment that offers dramatically less UV protection, alongside red hair and skin that burns easily and tans poorly. In a high UV environment, that mutation would have been a genuine liability, actively selected against. But in the consistently low UV environment of far northern Europe, researchers studying the distribution of MC1R variants have found the mutation wasn't just tolerated. It appears to have been mildly favored, likely because the reduced UV blocking effect made it easier to synthesize sufficient vitamin D in a place where sunlight is scarce for much of the year. A trait that would be actively dangerous near the equator became quietly advantageous a few thousand miles north, purely because the underlying environmental pressure had flipped. There's one more twist worth knowing, because it connects human pigmentation to a species that isn't even us anymore. Genetic research comparing modern human genomes to sequenced Neanderthal DNA has identified specific pigmentation-related gene variants in some present-day populations that appear to trace directly back to interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, who had already been living in lower UV European environments for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. In other words, at least part of the genetic toolkit some modern humans use to cope with low UV environments may not have originated in Homo sapiens at all. It may have been inherited directly from a different human species entirely, one that had already solved this exact problem long before we showed up. Here's the thing nobody tells you about what all of this actually means for how different two people with different skin tones really are, genetically speaking, because the honest answer surprises most people. Population geneticist Richard Lewontin, analyzing global genetic variation as far back as 1972, found something that has been repeatedly confirmed by far larger modern genomic studies since. Roughly 85 to 90% of total human genetic variation exists within any single population, not between different populations. Two people from the same village, on average, are almost as genetically different from each other as two people picked from opposite sides of the planet. Skin color is one of the small handful of traits that happens to track visibly and predictably with geography, purely because it responds directly to a geographic variable, UV radiation, in a way most other traits simply don't. Blood type doesn't cluster by continent this cleanly. Most disease resistance genes don't either. Skin pigmentation stands out precisely because sunlight itself is unevenly distributed across the globe, and pigmentation is one of the few traits under strong, direct selective pressure from that specific variable. It's a visible adaptation to a local environment, not a signal of some deeper, more fundamental division between groups of people. Put all of this together, and skin color stops looking like a fixed, ancient marker of deep biological difference, and starts looking like exactly what it actually is: one adaptive trait controlled by a small number of genes that has continued shifting independently, repeatedly, and remarkably recently in direct response to how much UV radiation hits the ground in a given place. It's not humanity diverging into separate branches. It's the same species, dispersed across wildly different environments, each population's skin quietly renegotiating the same trade-off between UV protection and vitamin D synthesis, over and over on separate continents using different genes, arriving at strikingly similar answers. So picture that same person again, standing in East Africa 200,000 years ago, dark-skinned under a relentless equatorial sun. Every descendant of theirs who eventually walked farther north into weaker sunlight and colder winters carried the exact same underlying biology, the same genes for melanin production, just waiting for enough generations of pressure to nudge them toward a different equilibrium. Skin color was never humanity splitting apart. It was one adaptable trait doing exactly what it evolved to do in as many different versions as there are patches of sunlight on Earth.